Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to never miss a video from Radio 1.
Right then, this is Drive with Erica on 94.3 Radio 1. And joining us today, we've got John Gloster. He's a sports physiotherapist to both elite athletes, the likes of the Indian and international cricketers, and of course, the general sporting population as well. So good to have you back with us on the show.
Fantastic to be here again, Erica, as always.
You know, I wanted to get someone in the professional sporting arena to share what are some of the daily rigors, to start off with, that elite athletes have to actually deal with on a day-to-day basis with respect to maybe their daily training, prepping for tournaments, training their body and mind to achieve excellence. So can you give us a little bit of an insight to that?
Well, they're so different. It's so different now, even compared to a year ago, Erica, because the environment has changed considerably. So we now have all these extra layers or levels of performance pressures and new pressures that are built into these athletes' lives. Before we had their operational pressures, we had their performance pressures, personal stressors. But now we have this extra layer called COVID, which has presented this really unique sort of operating environment for these athletes. And it's how we've managed to deal with that that's really been the big change over the last 12 months or so. So we've had to integrate into our system within the sort of what we call the new biosphere, biobubble world, this new layer of protection for these athletes and support staff. And that's the mental health layer, and appreciating that that's such a huge part of an athlete's life now, but even more so given the external pressures that are there around COVID, the fear of COVID, the fear of the sort of unknown, families in crisis, loss of loved ones. And then on top of that, the time that we're having to spend in these bio bubbles completely isolated from the rest of the world. So, you know, there's this extra layer that we've had to deal with, and we're looking at ways to sort of fill our toolboxes now with techniques and special sort of understandings of how to manage them more appropriately.
You know, we've had a fair few headlining stories in the last few weeks, especially with professional athletes at the top of their game citing mental health issues. Naomi Osaka being one. A few years ago, a star athlete dropping out of a major tournament over mental health issues might have been seen maybe as a sign of weakness. But today, I mean, her sponsors, for example, you know, are hailing her as being, you know, refreshingly honest. So what has changed in the past few years?
Yeah, as I said, a lot's changed, and a lot's changed in the last 12 to 18 months as well. And COVID has allowed us to now focus, fortunately, and drill down more on these issues with athletes and mental health. And athletes are like any other human beings. You know, they all have their daily issues, their personal issues, and outside of their physical issues, they have mental health issues. And that's why it's become such a big focus for us. Now, Naomi Osaka has always said that she doesn't enjoy public speaking, doesn't enjoy being in front of the media. And that's very, very common for a lot of elite athletes. We just assume that because they're so brave and put on this brave front during competition and they dominate that environment, that they should dominate all environments that they're in. But a lot of them don't. And I can recall many stories of particularly young cricketers, both here in the subcontinent and outside, particularly those that weren't as confident with speaking in English, were often afraid to perform during international matches because it meant that they would then have to front the media afterwards. And it placed a huge amount of stress on them, absolutely. And it was really interesting to talk to them through that process around this fear of performance, because it meant that they were then going to have to front the media. So it's a real live issue. And I think we've now got to go back and look at, as part of the education process with our athletes, that media and fronting the media should be part of that. Understanding the fear and stresses of all athletes needs to be part of the education process, not just for the athlete, but for the people that support those athletes. And me, as being part of the sort of the sport health support team, we need to have a greater awareness around these fears and often unknown, the unknown environment that a lot of these athletes are struggling with.
Right. I mean, it's interesting you should say that because, my next sort of lead-in question was going to be to the other athletes who perhaps like Naomi Osaka don't have the money purses to say, okay, let this tournament go by. I'm not going to attend. I will pay the fine of 20,000, pounds or dollars or whatever it is, So how do they deal with it? I mean, so taking it forward, do you see leagues, do you see sporting organizations taking cognizance of the fact that, someone like a Naomi Osaka, is dealing with mental health issues and we need to address it on a larger platform?
Completely. And I know for a fact that the big leagues are doing that. And individually, certainly as a franchise like Rajasthan Royals, we've baked in that layer into our support staff network as well. This first of all, appreciating that these issues are going to come up more and more often because of the constraints of the environments that we're all in,
Yep.
and in the context of COVID, but also because it's playing out in real life for these athletes in front of spectators and in front of the world. So we need to ensure that these layers are in place to protect these athletes. And fortunately, over the last 12 months or so, we've become a lot more comfortable communicating, particularly in this medium, in the virtual medium, which has allowed us to therefore communicate more effectively with our athletes and our players through this medium, but also to interact with sports psychologists and mental conditioning coaches. So they've become more comfortable at talking about these issues and these problems. So the athletes who may not have the direct support services or the financial ability to sort of step away from these tournaments, these protective, helpful layers are now being built into the tournaments themselves. So all of the major tournaments now have sports psychologists for the athletes and support staff also to talk to. And the individual support teams around some of these, particularly the franchises in the IPL, have also either in-house support networks or virtual support networks. So the beauty about the last 12 months or so is that we now have more confidence in approaching these topics, and we now have the tools in place to help athletes with these problems as well.
Okay. So, I mean, Naomi Osaka, Adam Zampa, when it came to the IPL as well, all, being very upfront and vocal about their mental health issues. Is this like a generational thing? Is today's Gen Zers or, far more open about their mental health awareness, mental health issues, and their mental fitness, as even perhaps like millennials. As for the baby boomers, I mean, forget about that. We never ever spoke about that. So is this like a generational shift, you think, in mindset?
Fortunately, I think it is, and fortunately, we're now accepting of the fact that elite level athletes have paved the way for a lot of other people to appreciate that this is a topic that can be discussed. There are people out there who can help you with these issues. And I think it's a really wonderful thing that some of our big athletes on the international stage have put their hand up and said, we're not coping. And it's okay to not cope. And it's also okay to put your hand up and say, where can I get help from? We just have to be in a position to deliver on that and help them wherever possible with the best possible tools at our disposal. So for me, managing some of these athletes, we come back and we look at, what does it mean by being mentally resilient, and how do we then bake that into their training, into their preparation? Like I said, education is going to be a big part going forward around this. Now that it's in the public domain, that we're more confident and comfortable talking about these issues. But I think we've got to take a step back even further and look at how we bring up our kids. And how are we preparing these kids for life, and what tools are we putting into their toolboxes at a very young age, so to give them that ability to cope with any situation, whether that be physical or mental or environmental. We've spent so much time, certainly in my profession, focusing on the physical. We've really left the mental out of the equation. Yep. So I think the greater exposure we can give to these, particularly our younger athletes and our kids, to life experiences, the greater the increased ability to cope. And for me, I think it comes back to failure. And it's probably the most important part of growing up. And one of the most important tools building a tool to cope is through failure. And I think we protect or overprotect kids too much from failure when they're younger. So when it does hit them later on in life, they don't have the mechanisms to cope. So I think we need to take a really big sort of overview of this and go right back to how we educate our kids, how we expose our kids to sport, how we expose them to failure. And then that will therefore, over time, perhaps build a more resilient and more durable athlete as they come into the elite level.
Right. You know, you've been in the circuit for so long, and you've worked with so many athletes. You can kind of gauge their mental makeup, you know, by the way they play the game, by the way they handle themselves. Can you share with us maybe a couple of pointers so, you know, parents of young kids who are training hard in sport can kind of sense that, hang on, something is not quite right. You know, how can we get help? Or is this the time for me to seek professional help?
Yeah, I think the parent is probably going to be the first person to pick up on what we call the red flags. At our level, we've always had this big focus on screening our kids, physical screening. We do musculoskeletal screening to check they're not going to get injured. But I really think for a lot of our young athletes, then, and particularly as they go into the more elite stages, we need to start doing mental health screening as well, so that we can then identify red flags very early on. So that's something that we're starting to build into the system. And it's something that you can also do with younger kids, particularly young kids who you feel have got a future in sport. So we started looking at the overtraining. We used to only look at the overtraining of the physical body and for red flags there, but now we're looking for what we call overtraining of the mind as well, and looking for red flags. So parents need to be aware of changes in what's normal for their kids, losing appetite, sleep disruptions, poor communication or varying levels of communication. And so we see often these mental health red flags manifesting themselves in physical conditions first. But if we have a really good understanding of that athlete or that child, both from the perspective of the parent as well as the clinician who may be working with them, through various screening tools and knowing them more intimately, then we can pick up earlier on these red flags. But then once we've done that, do we have the tools in place to then help them? And I believe that in India, we have some really, really good support mechanisms now for your young athletes for support in the mental health space. So mental sports conditioning professionals are there now in the system, and they're available both virtually as well as in one-on-one. So the system is in place. Now we just need to be better at identifying what those red flags are, in our young athletes.
Right. And, you know, finally taking it out to the wider world of sport, that is now being accosted with this whole concept of mental health and having to go through, stressful, press releases and press sessions and, post tournament conferences. Will there be a foreseeable shift? Do you think the whole industry needs to kind of introspect a little bit, because there's a lot riding on it in terms of monies, in terms of media obligations and all of that? Do you see a shift coming?
Yeah, I just think we need to be more sensitive to it. And, you've got to understand the world of sponsorship is that when a sponsor signs up to a franchise or a particular individual, then effectively they're signing up to exposure and exposing that athlete, because ultimately if you're exposing that athlete more, then you're exposing the sponsor's product more. And so we need to go back to the contractual level and look at how we're contracting these athletes and these franchises to expose these athletes in the public domain. So from the legal perspective, I think we need to be a little bit more sensitive. And there should be clauses in these contracts for certain individuals that their exposure be less or not as confronting, or it's done in a domain which is far more sensitive to them and their particular sort of condition that they may have. So it's about us being better educated. It's about the management of some of these large corporations and large franchises to be more sensitive to the athletes, and understanding that everybody's not the same. Not everybody has a brave face. As I said, they may be brave on the sporting field and incredible with their performances there, but that's not the complete individual. There's another whole side to that person that we're not aware of, which we need to be more aware of. And then that comes back to my point before about how well do we actually know our athletes, particularly from the mental health perspective. Right. And that's the bit that we need to be focusing on more and more in the near future.
Well, fingers crossed for stronger athletes, stronger in mind, and body, importantly. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure, John.
Always a pleasure. And thanks so much for the role that you guys are all playing into bringing this to the fore and making the job of us a lot easier, but also making the athletes more comfortable. And I think we're going to see better, more resilient athletes coming out the other side of COVID because of these skills that we're learning all the way through this.
Fingers crossed.
Wonderful.
94.3 Radio 1. One world, your station.